On the 23rd of June, the UK votes on membership of the European Union. A Tory reaction to the rise of UKIP, the referendum marks a high point in the influence of the right in British politics. At the same time, the referendum presents an opportunity to imagine the creation of a genuine democratic federation, the kind of transnational democracy long opposed by European elites. In or out? We'll discuss the politics of the European Union, the consequences of Brexit, and whether another Europe really is possible. I'm Michael Walker. This is The Fix. So, joining me to debate the EU referendum are Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media, Anindya Bhattacharya, a writer and activist with RS21, Marina Prentoulis, a member of Syriza and a spokesperson for Another Europe is Possible, and Lucy Anderson, a Labour member of the European Parliament for London. But first, here's the newsreel.
At the outset of the Cold War, European states sought to consolidate their peace and prosperity following World War II. Now geared towards making European economies competitive in an era of globalisation, the EU has become a largely neoliberal institution. When the 2008 financial crisis threatened to collapse the euro, harsh austerity measures were imposed on Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain at the behest of the German government and the European Central Bank. The defeat of Greece's radical left government, Syriza, confirmed the hold of austerity in Europe, dashing the hopes of social democratic reformers. At the same time, while millions flee civil wars, European governments have sought to block the safe passage of refugees into Europe. In the UK, the rise of UKIP and the resurgence of Euroscepticism has forced the Tories to call the coming referendum on Britain's EU membership. While Labour will back the In campaign, Corbyn has criticised the EU's lack of democracy. As Yanis Varoufakis has argued, another Europe may be possible, but the European left remains divided as to whether reform or rupture can best achieve transnational democracy.
We're going to begin our discussion with the 1-minute round, where each guest has 60 seconds to answer the same question. So we'll get straight to the point, all cards on the table. How should progressives vote in the EU referendum and why? Lucy, your 60 seconds.
The first thing is to get back to basics on the EU, and for me as a Labour Party representative, it's all about democratic socialism. It's what our members believe in, it's what our leader was elected to campaign for, so the question is whether continuing a UK membership of the EU either helps or hinders that goal to have a society that works for the many and not just the few, both in this country and internationally. So if you look systematically and forensically at the provisions of the EU treaties, at the implementation of EU policy and EU law and the actions of the institutions, the answer for me is that the question's got to be that it's better in than better out. Most people would agree that we want to keep free movement for ordinary workers and students and not just high earners. We also must ensure the creation of more secure and quality jobs and preserve and improve employment rights as well as environmental and consumer protections. Nobody on the side of leaving the EU has got any concrete answers about how that could be done. So as Len McCluskey said last week, this debate is really about hope, solidarity and renewal. And that is the basis on which we must stay in and fight for a better EU.
Brilliant. Marina?
Well, I agree with Lucy. I believe that if we want to have progressive politics, we have to remain in the European Union. The Greek case was used quite a lot against this and trying to show that the EU is neoliberal. But why we have to stay in is because we have to change this neoliberal balance of power that exists within the EU. To give another example, again from Greece, in relation to the refugee crisis, all these matters, they can only be sorted if we have transnational cooperation and solidarity. And this is why we have to stay in. So we have to avoid any temptation, or in some cases the fantasy, that by leaving the EU suddenly and magically we will have progressive politics. The power is with transnational capital, and if we want to stop transnational capital, we have to stay together and try to change the EU and make it more progressive.
Brilliant, thank you. Bat?
Well, this has always been a divisive issue on the left, and I think part of the reason for that is the terms are set. It's framed by the right, an argument between Cameron and UKIP. And I think maybe about a year ago, my instinct was a pox on both your houses and to abstain or something like that. But the events of last year and the ones that Marina mentioned, specifically what happened to Greece and the Syrian refugee crisis, for me crystallised, watching how the EU operated there crystallised for me that it is a fundamentally malign institution. It's not something that can be reformed by piecemeal. And I think it's very, very important that the left makes that very clear and puts a clear case as to what the fundamental problems with the EU are. Now, my feeling is that if we don't take this opportunity in this referendum to say that we are against the EU as an institution, that critique will be lost. It will be pulled into basically Cameron's campaign to stay. And that's why I think no matter how hard it is, we have to be clear about the EU is a bad thing and we have to vote to leave.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Aaron?
Right, so I think that progressives in June should vote to leave. Here's why. One, it's undemocratic. More power resides with the unelected European Commission than with the European Parliament. The Scottish Parliament has more powers than the European Parliament. Number two, trade. The EU, again, it's the Commission that defines trade policy, not the Parliament. It's unelected, it's unaccountable. This is a continuation of colonialist politics, practices, policies, albeit through other means, through trade rather than war and through force of arms as it was before the Second World War. Number three, TTIP. TTIP will make socialist policies illegal. It will lead to big lawsuits. It'll cost billions if, say, Corbyn in 2020 came to power or Sinn Féin led a coalition government in Ireland anytime soon. It would be illegal to enact socialist policies, deprivatisations, nationalisations. Finally, freedom of movement. Yes, we have freedom of movement in the EU for white Europeans, right? And increasingly, as this demographic crisis continues, that internal freedom of movement will come at the cost of the most militarised borders in the world around its periphery.
Brilliant, thank you. Lots of disagreements there, good sign.
Yes.
Disagreements over, I think, the nature of the EU. Is it essentially a malign institution or can it be a positive force?
Can I start
Marina?
on that? Because I want to respond to you. And we have to start by saying that, because you mentioned Greece as well, that yes, there are problems with the EU as it operates right now. And the problem is that you have national governments that right now they're competing which one is more fascist, which one is going to be more nationalistic and close the borders. And the other side, which is a very right-wing side, is doing quite well in destroying this union. So what I'm saying is that we should have a radical, critical perspective, stay in the EU, but try to change the problems that we have.
And I want to pick you up also on the undemocratic point.
Yeah.
The European Parliament has increasing powers through co-decision, which means it can radically change legislation, it can vote it down, it can suggest own initiatives, which may or may not be taken up, but often are, and often influence policy. The basic democratic nature of the EU, which isn't one institution, it's a number of institutions, stems from the treaties, which have total safeguards for the kinds of things that you were talking about. It has safeguards for employment rights, it has safeguards for environmental rights, consumer protection. There's Article 9 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union says that EU institutions must act in order to promote social and employment rights. So the idea that it's not democratic, because fundamentally it's EU governments that form the decision-making in most cases for a lot of the things that we're talking about, including some of the ways that Greece was treated, which is outside of a lot of the scope of the treaties, outside of the scope of EU primary law. So when I listen to some of the people who want exit, they're talking about an entirely different debate. Let's get back to the actual facts of what it means to be in or out the EU without all of these distractions.
And
I think I'm going to let Aaron
I mean, the whole
respond.
thing that like the EU plays by a sort of, it plays by the book. We can talk about codes and conventions and treaties. The ECB last summer tried to start a run on Greek banks. These people do not care about the rule of law. They do not care about all these conventions and charters.
The ECB isn't the EU.
No, but I'm
it
saying,
is one of the EU
yeah,
institutions.
None
You
of these,
don't draw a distinction
none of these
between
bodies,
what the various powers
look,
are.
Politics is about expediency. Bureaucracies want to maximise their competences. They want to have as many resources as possible. That's in organisational psychology. We know that. The EU... any of these bodies, when we talk about the Troika, it's a number of different...
including the IMF, which has nothing to do with
you could talk about the British civil service. The bureaucracies are bureaucracies. My point is, politics about expediency, to defend this monstrosity, to defend the Eurozone, they will do it by any means necessary.
Because you mentioned again the Greek case, and the Greek case, it is quite important.
I want to bring us back to, obviously the Greek case is incredibly interesting, but I want to bring us back to the effect that the EU has on Britain. You seem to be saying that the EU acts as a defender of labour rights. We've also called the EU a neoliberal institution. How do these two...
OK, well, let me just deal with that. We absolutely know that this Tory government, if it had half a chance, would repeal a lot of the employment rights that are based on European law, but they cannot do it. So, of course, we had some laws before. We had equal pay laws, for example, but we had a massive fight with the benefit of the European Court backing us up to get equal pay for work of equal value, not just a very narrow concept of equal pay. That's an absolute example. There's no way that the Tory government would allow a lot of these protections to continue. We've already got a massive fight to defend trade union rights in this country. The last thing we want is to give them, make it easier for them, for example, to do away with the Human Rights Act, which they want to do. It'd be much easier for them to do that if we're outside the EU. So you're enabling the right wingers.
I've got a question for you, right?
Yes.
Do you not think that the general direction of travel in terms of workers' rights is moving towards Britain? This idea that Europe is an anchor for Britain, it's not true. The rest of the continent is moving towards the British model, right? The increasingly neoliberal weak unions model, low pay,
because
destroy organised labour.
The national governments that exist in the EU, they have this agenda and they're pushing this agenda.
Global capitalism has that agenda, sure.
Yeah, of course, but at some point we have a discussion if we are going to have a social Europe or a neoliberal Europe. The fact that there are neoliberal governments, that they are imposing austerity and they are trying to destroy our rights, we have to deal it in the same way that we deal with national politics.
I suppose the argument is it's harder to deal with the EU than in national politics.
When we say about the EU being undemocratic, the same we say about liberal democracy on national level. And we are there and we are fighting it and we are trying again to change the power and get away from the government that we have now, which is the worst nightmare that we were ever expecting, and have a different government with it. And the same way it should happen with the EU. We have to change the balance of powers. We have to put progressive governments on national level and vote for them. And I hope the Labour Party is going to play that, and a Labour Party which will be led by Corbyn. And this is how you change the balance of powers. You don't just walk out, especially in the case of Britain, when neoliberalism and your Thatcher politics were pushed on all of us.
I'm going to bring in back at this point.
Let's call it capitalism, Marina. It's not born in any country.
I do think that the fundamental issue here is what is the nature of the EU as an organisation, because Lilis, you characterised it in two ways that I think were in contradiction with each other. On the one hand, you talked about European Parliament and the ability to alter legislation and so on. On the other hand, and I think this is more accurate, you described it as a series of interlocking institutions and committees and what have you. And my worry is that if workers in Britain or in any country in Europe, if their employment rights and their rights to organise as workers are reliant upon what is essentially a labyrinthine bureaucracy with a coating, a veneer of democracy added to it, that's a very, very weak basis on which, workers' rights did not come because the ruling class decided that it would be nice to give it to us. Workers had to fight for it. And I don't think that the fact that in Britain workers' rights have been on the defensive for many, many years, I can see why the temptation arises that, maybe the French government and the German government can bail us out here. But I think in the long run, that is a very, very dangerous basis.
It's about improving decent standards for everyone. It's about organising. We need to organise, we need to win elections, but we can't do that if we're out of the game.
Last point of Aaron.
Can I say, there's three things I want to say very, very quickly. Arguments for the EU from the left are based on domestic weaknesses. We're governed by the right. It's always going to be that way. If that's what people think, if it's based on failure, it's based on weakness, let's just give up. I'm happy to go. I'll start a cocktail bar up the road. Let's give up on politics. Let me finish, Marina. Second point, strategy of change. Let's change all the member states' governments. You would need a left-wing government in two of the next three states, France, Germany, the UK. We know the second there's a left-wing government, look at Syriza. Look how scared the European ruling class was of Podemos. They stamp it out. The idea that they'll allow two of these to emerge in the two of the three most powerful member states is fantasy. Third point, workers' rights. When were they strongest in Europe? But the early 1970s, the mid 1960s, there's no correlation between strong working rights, strong labour regulations.
Equality rights.
Well, okay, but
What
that's
about
a global
women,
phenomenon.
black
That's really
people,
disingenuous. That's
disabled
really
people?
disingenuous.
It's
That's a
absolutely
global phenomenon.
true.
They were terrible around the world then. In Europe, labour rights were stronger before the 1970s.
The power is with transnational capital, which I think you agree, and if you
Yeah,
want
well,
to
I'm
stop
sure
it,
we
you
will
can do it only on transnational level, with unity and with solidarity. You are not going to stop it.
I haven't got any solidarity with Jeremy Disselbaum.
A coalition of European governments is somehow opposed to transnational capital. I'd say that's an institution of transnational capital.
Well, what I will say on that is that on March 18th and 20th, there is the Alliance Against Austerity. It's taking place in Athens. Labour members will be there. European Greens are going to be there. And what we are seeing there is the creation of alliances, cutting across different party formations within the EU, which are trying to do exactly that. Stop neoliberalism, stop austerity.
How can you regulate properly if you're only doing it on a nation-state basis? When you've got issues like the environment, you've got issues like bankers bonuses, which the EU maybe it could have been better, but at least it regulated, and our government hated it. So it's not true to say that the EU isn't addressing these things. Maybe not as fast as we would like, which is why we want to stay in.
I'm sorry. We've been discussing the benefits of leaving the EU from a fairly left-wing perspective, mainly focusing on workers' rights. Obviously, these aren't the terms that have been defining the mainstream debate. Here's Cameron, Corbyn and Farage on the referendum.
Well, I want what's best for Britain, and I think what's best for Britain is staying in a reformed European Union because we'll be better off safeguarding our position in this massive single free market that we have in Europe. I think we'll be stronger in the world, being able to get things done, whether that's making sure our country is safe and our people are safe. And I think we'll fight terrorism and criminality better. We'll be safer inside the EU because we're able to work with our partners, strength in numbers in a dangerous world.
The Labour Party and the trade union movement are overwhelmingly for staying in because we believe that the European Union has brought investment, jobs and protection for workers, consumers and environment, and we are convinced that a vote to remain is in the best interests of the people. In the 21st century, Mr. Speaker, as a country and as a continent, and indeed as a human race, we face some challenging issues. All of these issues are serious, pressing, and self-evidently can only be solved by international cooperation.
What people really want to see in this renegotiation is, can we get back control of our borders? Can our parliament, in some circumstances, be supreme? And why is EU membership costing us so much money?
Tory backbenchers and UKIP drove Cameron to call the referendum. The In campaign relies on businessmen stoking fear about Britain's economic future, and the Out campaign relies on right-wing populists stoking fear about migration. Amid this fairly gross spectacle, can the left have a voice? I'll start with the In campaign. Have you found it difficult to distinguish your voice from Cameron and co?
Well, actually, no. I think the Labour In campaign has been very strong. Our leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has been very strong on this. Whenever he makes speeches, he made one yesterday in Newcastle, he talked very, very persuasively about why it makes sense for workers' rights.
What are his reasons? Workers' rights.
Workers' rights, for staying in and fighting for a better EU, and about the importance of jobs and growth and trade to the UK. So
jobs and growth isn't that different from?
Well, it depends what type of jobs you're talking about.
Okay,
You're talking about quality, secure jobs, not jobs at any price, not zero-hours contracts. And we've made that very clear all along, and those messages are getting across.
And Aaron and Bat, you found yourselves with even stranger bedfellows.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to be on the same side of an argument as somebody like a Nigel Farage, but I don't think actually people said, well, how could you say this? You're agreeing with these awful people with terrible politics. Well, so be it. There are awful people with terrible politics on both sides of the debate. That shouldn't inhibit somebody who's against the EU, who is for Britain leaving, to be very clear and concise about their arguments. And I'm for leaving for a very different set of reasons. You said that jobs and growth is why we should be in. That's what Jeremy thinks. Jobs and growth, sure, but jobs and growth based on what kind of trade and with who. If you look at EU trade policy with Sub-Saharan Africa, these economic cooperation agreements, they are locking out Sub-Saharan Africa, they're de-developing them. This is colonialism by other means. For an internationalist like Jeremy Corbyn, I find that very difficult to believe that he's selling that as a message to the British working class. And one more thing.
Well, that's absolutely not what I said.
One more thing, sorry, I just finished this. You know, the Northeast is the most Eurosceptic part of the country. And this is a Labour sort of heartland. And unless Labour makes really honest and clear arguments about the EU and what could be done to reform it, I don't think it can be reformed. There are some arguments that do wash with me for staying in, but it can't be reformed dramatically. Let's be honest. Let's stop deceiving the British electorate.
I don't think the argument that the left internationalist argument against the EU is the same argument as Farage's. So I wouldn't say we are on the same side. We happen to be putting X's in the same box, but the arguments are quite different.
I suppose the problem is, though, however good your motives,
well,
are you not going to hand him a...
Well, there is. The left has quite a weak voice in this debate. It's framed by the right on both sides. We saw that clip of Cameron and that chilling Orwellian phrase, strength in numbers in dangerous times. Now, that is going to set the tenor of the Remain campaign. And I know that Jeremy Corbyn has done rallies like that, but you look at the standard Labour propaganda for remaining in Europe, and it is echoing all of Cameron's points: terrorism, security, etc., etc.
That's not. There are variety. Look at the trade union leaders who are now coming out.
Well,
look at Len
that's very
McCluskey.
good. But what I'm saying is that Labour's campaign is by no means.
I mean, there are two Labour campaigns,
yes,
really, aren't there?
Effectively, and that I think points to certain slippage between. In the way that the Remain campaign
Aaron and Marina.
I'll be very quick. You know, I've been told by a few people that Trickett wanted to do a campaign. John Trickett, he's running the local election sort of machine for this May. He wanted to front a campaign to get Britain out of the EU last year. He bottled it. Owen Jones was saying in The Guardian, let's get out of the EU. He bottled it. Jeremy Corbyn, he has been against the EU, or a certain kind of EU, which I agree with, a neoliberal EU, for a very long time. And guess what? He bottled it. Why? It's pretty understandable. It would have really broken his leadership, right? I get that. But let's be honest. A lot of Labour and a lot of Labour supporters are against the EU.
No, you're unfair. It's because we start, all of these people that you mentioned, we start from a premise that we should try to change the balance of power within the EU. We have to make it better. We should not allow neoliberalism to dominate there. And when you start from this premise, then you are trying to explain how we are going to go about having a different EU. So our position, the left position for all of us, I think it's more difficult in a certain way. But let me talk not only about...
Can I just come back on that? Because, I mean, it's just not true that anyone bottled anything.
John Trickett was fronting a campaign.
People were genuinely convinced by the arguments within the party and within the trade unions about the balances when they looked at the details. As I said at the beginning...
What do you mean the balances?
The balances in terms of the rights as opposed to what the issues were in theory, in the big picture, and how we can run things on our own as a nation state and have socialism and that will all work. When we looked very much at the detail and everyone went through it, those arguments were had. It's not true that anyone bottled anything.
And it's not only the Labour Party, we have to say that as well. I mean, with another Europe that, as I said, I'm working with, it's cross-party alliances and a lot of activists that they are very willing to go door to door, since we don't have that much access with the mainstream media, and have this debate, because I think there is, it should have happened earlier, and I think in terms of Britain, not many people understand what is the EU and how it is operated. And the problem with that is that always Britain had a certain distance.
The left comes from an anti-imperialist position, anti-colonial position. It's very difficult to say Britain is a particularly important country. It is. It's the sixth biggest economy in the world. It's a major player. It's in the G8, the G20, UN Security Council. Would we have more leverage right now? Right, our trade policies decided at the level of the EU with the Commission. The EU, the US and Japan are the big players in WTO. If Britain leaves, they'd have so much more leverage. And
do we want Britain to have leverage?
Yeah, in effect, it can't get much worse. No, but again, it boils down to this argument of, do you believe we could have a left-wing government in this country? If you don't, then I think all these arguments, then you're right. I think I do want a left-wing government in Britain with leverage, yes. And the point is, we are in all these organisations, outside it, with a left-wing government, we could have so much influence on the world stage in changing the international finance institutions, the G8, the UN Security Council. So, yeah, it pains a lot of people on the left to say it, but Britain does punch above its, above its weight on the world stage. Let's try and use that for some benefit, right? For some good.
Which has never happened so far. So I want to ask you how we are going to deal with the refugee crisis. The day you leave and the day after that, we are talking about internationalism, solidarity. You are not going to be part of the problem. Britain will not have a voice. The groups that they are working for the crisis are not.
Right.
Okay, Aaron, briefly.
No, I mean, look, the point is, I agree with you, Northern Europe is completely screwing over Greece. It's turning it into a giant open-air detention centre for non-European migrants. Why would you want to stay in this thing, actually?
Because
that's the big question for me.
Nationalisms that they create the situations, all these countries that they close their borders. I want more Europe to make them open.
They're not going to do it. They're going to keep on crapping on Greece.
I mean, and if they are going to open their borders, it's not going to be down to Britain, presumably. I mean, one premise of your organisation...
But what I'm saying there is that instead of seeing unity and solidarity, you have nationalism and national politics emerging, and different countries, even within the European Union, saying, I don't give a shit about unity, we don't care about solidarity, which is part of the EU.
It's not an internationalist institution, though, it's a supranationalist.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time there, so we're going to have to move to the final 1 minute round. Aaron, you're up first. I want prescriptions, but also action points. How do you see the next 4 months panning out, and how should progressives intervene in the EU referendum? 60 seconds.
Okay, well, very quickly, I think that the argument for Legxit, left exit, it should have been made last year. It did flop. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I think a few people basically got cold feet. Owen Jones, John Trickett, people around Corbyn. I think Hilary Benn had undue influence over a few of those decisions. That's gone. We can't change it. The left, unfortunately, is not going to have a distinct voice in this debate. I think we all agree that's probably gone. This show is happening, but this is not a conversation in the mainstream media. What we can do is ensure that the day after this vote, whatever way it goes, we can have some influence. So let's say we vote to leave. The week after, right, we need a demonstration in Westminster, 30, 40, 50,000 people saying, we want open borders, we want to be a part of solving the refugee crisis, we want to be a part of helping our brothers and sisters in Greece, but we want to do that as a country on a very different trajectory to a neoliberal EU. We could do that. Imagine the terrain we would have. Cameron stepped down, crisis in the Conservative Party, political crisis. The left could really actually have a huge opportunity. So let's be a little bit optimistic about here. Let's think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. Final thing, let's start to compose some policies. So what would a migration policy, a progressive migration policy in Britain look like if we left the EU? Right now we haven't got an answer. I agree. Let's do something about that.
On the question of migration, I think in terms of what the left could do, there is a strategic priority with saying as loud and clear as possible, open borders, borders kill, and arguing for migration rights on every level. Now, my issue about the arguments around the EU is they're based on the notion that we're going to have this good thing that's free movement within Europe without the bad thing of Fortress Europe. And I think those are very much two sides of the same coin. The EU is not an internationalist institution, it is a supranationalist institution. It is creating a European nationalism, and especially if you look at the discourse of the right against the Syrians refugees, it is all about how Muslim refugees are threatening Christendom. Now, I do not think it is possible to replace one kind of nationalism with a larger European one. I think that would be a very bad route to go down. However, in terms of what the left has to do over the next few months and years, I think campaigning for migrant rights, whether they are from in the EU or out of the EU, that has to be a strategic priority.
Marina.
I think the first thing that we have to do, and Aaron, I start to agree with you now, which is the good thing when it comes to action. The first thing is to make this campaign ours, which probably it isn't yet, and in there try to start about a radical different vision that we have in relation to the EU or other forms of transnational unity that we may have. I think the referendum is an opportunity for us. It is an opportunity to bring these discussions to the forefront, although we have to work a lot, and start working, as I said before, on different levels. In relation to the refugee crisis, there is the UN Convention, there is Article 19 probably of the EU Charter, which right now they have been pushed on the side. We have to create a campaign, we have to demand that there are no mass expulsions, which is where the situation goes, or as you said, Greece turning into a detention center, and start being very critical in relation to the EU-Turkey deal, which of course we all know what Erdogan is and what it stands and what he's doing the last few days.
Lucy.
Well, I think the first thing is that when you look at the next few months, I think the left arguments are going to be heard more and more, because people who I talk to, when I go out canvassing and talking to people on street stalls, they really want to know what it's really all about. And we're in the position to tell them, because we can talk about issues at their everyday lives. So, for example, jobs. So, for example, investment in regions. There's millions and millions of euros, millions and millions of pounds available for projects to support small businesses, to projects to help tackle climate change. And those kinds of things people want to hear about. And secondly, it's also not true to say that Britain doesn't have an influence in the EU, so therefore we'd be better off out, particularly on things, climate change, tackling climate change. Ed Miliband, for example, he was a leader in terms of climate change policy, and that influenced a lot of the things that were then taken forward at EU level. How can you, in terms of progressive internationalism, the EU has been an excellent force on environmental issues, whether it still could do better, whether it's air pollution or anything else, but goodness knows where we'd be in London. We're in a bad enough state anyway, but without EU standards on air pollution, where would we be? So similarly,
60 seconds.
I think it's all to play for, and we should listen to these arguments.
Okay, thank you everyone. That's a lot to think about over the coming months. Thanks for watching The Fix. You can follow us on @thefix_TV on Twitter, on Facebook @thefixtv, and of course tune in to Novara in 3 weeks' time for our next episode. See you then.